Welcome to the deep dive. Before we even really get started today, do us a huge favor.
Yeah, hit that like button.
Exactly. Hit like, subscribe to support the show. It really helps us keep doing what we do, and it ensures you never miss out on these really extensive explorations.
And you are definitely going to want to hear this one.
Oh, absolutely. Today we have something incredibly extensive, incisive, and just fascinating lined up for you. We are reviewing a highly controversial new ebook,
One that has been generating massive shockwaves online.
like intense debate across multiple platforms. It's called Insidious Satanic Marxism, Catabolic Cultural Revolutions, Positional War, Purity Spirals, Purges, and the Woke Mind Virus.
By Conrad Riker.
Right, by Conrad Riker. I know that title is an absolute mouthful.
It really sets the tone then.
It sets the exact tone for what we're about to explore today. And if you are intrigued by what we unpack today, and believe me, you will be, and you want to read the source material for yourself, you absolutely must check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the ebook.
Yeah, and be sure to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack.
So, the mission of this deep dive today is to really unpack the author's intense forensic analysis. He's looking at how Western institutions, and we mean everything, corporate HR, public schools, the military, how they've allegedly been captured by Marxist and feminist ideologies.
Riker is essentially offering a comprehensive autopsy of modern society,
Right.
and it's specifically targeted at understanding how the foundational structures of the West have been, in his view, fundamentally altered.
Okay, let's unpack this, but first we really need to offer a crucial disclaimer right off the top. The context here is vital.
Very vital.
The views presented in this book are highly politically charged, so we want to make it crystal clear to you, the listener, that we are not taking sides here.
No, not at all.
We are not endorsing the author's viewpoints, and we're not condemning them either. Our job, our sole mission today, is to impartially report on the content provided. We're here to understand the architecture of these arguments.
Exactly. If you're a men's rights activist or part of the red-pilled manosphere demographic, this book is speaking directly to you. It's attempting to explain the history of our institutions before they were allegedly captured.
And for everyone else listening, we are treating this as a fascinating sociological and rhetorical analysis of the author's worldview. We just want to understand how this argument is constructed.
That is the perfect way to frame it. We're dissecting the anatomy of his argument. He claims he's mapping out an ideological infection. Now, let me quickly clarify a term in that very long title that might throw some people off.
Yeah, the catabolic part.
Right, catabolic cultural revolution. For those who might not remember their high school biology, catabolic refers to the metabolic process of breaking down complex molecules to release energy.
Like digestion, basically.
Exactly like that. In a sociological context, Riker uses this term to describe a movement that breaks down the existing cultural structures, literally devouring the energy and capital of the old system to fuel its own growth.
So it's feeding on the host.
Exactly. He argues that this takeover wasn't accomplished through military force or open warfare. It was through something far more subtle, pervasive, and catabolic.
So it's an inside job, essentially, according to his framework. Which brings us to the first major mechanism Riker identifies. He introduces this concept he calls lexical subversion.
This is a huge part of his thesis.
It really is. He argues that the ideological takeover happened by weaponizing language itself. The core premise here is that if you can control the words people use, you can control the boundaries of their thoughts.
What's fascinating here is how he tracks this.
Yeah, I want to look at the first specific example he points to, which comes straight from the tech world. He brings up this 2017 internal memo from Google.
Oh, right, the coding language shift.
Yeah, it instructed engineers to stop using the terms blacklist and whitelist and replace them with blocklist and allow list. Now, let me play devil's advocate for a second. On the surface, a lot of people might look at that and say, sure, that's just a mild sensitivity update.
Right, just removing racially loaded terms from code.
Exactly. What's the big deal? Why does Riker view this as a massive red flag?
Because Riker interprets this not as a genuine effort at racial sensitivity, but as a mechanism of psychological conditioning.
Conditioning.
Yes, he asserts that by reframing a completely neutral, binary technical term into a moral litmus test, the company was essentially training its developers to think in approved ideological categories.
So the language stops being about the code.
Language, in this instance, stops functioning as a tool for precise clarity in coding and becomes a mechanism for compliance. Riker draws a direct line here to Orwellian doublethink.
Wow.
His argument is that when an institution commands you to alter your vocabulary for reasons that defy objective technical utility, they aren't protecting marginalized groups. They are testing your obedience to the ideology.
They're seeing if you'll bend the knee.
Right. They are seeing if you will subordinate objective reality to subjective morality.
That is a staggering way to view a simple corporate memo. And he argues this phenomenon doesn't stop in Silicon Valley boardrooms, right? He takes us down to the level of early childhood education.
Which is where it gets really insidious, according to his model.
He points to a Canadian preschool where teachers literally banned the terms king and queen from the chessboard.
From a chessboard.
Yes. They claimed the words were hierarchical and gendered. So they renamed the pieces top hat and crown. He points out the sheer absurdity of taking a centuries-old game of strategy and policing its terminology so toddlers don't experience hypothetical gender trauma.
He explicitly calls this a linguistic lobotomy in the text.
A linguistic lobotomy, yeah. And then he pairs that with an example of a summer camp in Texas that banned counselors from addressing children as boys and girls. They were mandated to use the term campers instead. Walk me through what Riker thinks the long-term goal of this linguistic policing actually is.
From the author's perspective, this erosion of natural communication is deeply deliberate. Riker argues that the moment you replace natural, biologically descriptive language like boys and girls, or king and queen with vague, bureaucratic euphemisms, you create ambiguity.
And ambiguity is useful to them.
Ambiguity is the oxygen of ideological control, in his view. By referring to children as campers instead of boys and girls, he suggests society is engaging in a forced infantilization wrapped in the guise of inclusion.
So you're blurring reality.
You are blurring biological reality to make room for a specific ideological narrative, one that claims gender is merely a social construct. Riker views this as a way to disorient children from a very young age, making them more malleable.
Okay, so we see how this language policing works with toddlers and campers. But Riker argues this ideological framing follows these kids all the way into higher education. He points to UC Berkeley, where a biology syllabus literally listed equity as a learning objective right alongside cellular respiration and DNA replication.
Equity in a hard science class.
This is what blew my mind. We are talking about a hard science course prioritizing a sociological concept over, or at least alongside, scientific literacy. How does Riker back up the claim that this is a systemic issue rather than just one rogue professor?
He backs it up with some really compelling linguistic data. He cites Google Enneagram data, which tracks the frequency of words published in books over time. The data shows that the phrase lived experience has seen a 700% increase in published literature in recent years.
700%, that's massive.
Conversely, the phrase objective evidence has declined by 41%.
Let's pause right there. For listeners who might not be deep into sociological theory, what exactly does Riker mean when he calls this an epistemic shift? Can you give us an ELI 5 explain, like I'm 5 on that concept?
Absolutely. Epistemology is simply the study of how we know, what constitutes truth.
Right.
An epistemic shift means that the fundamental way society decides what is true is changing. For hundreds of years, the West relied on the scientific method, logic, and objective evidence to determine truth.
The Enlightenment model.
Exactly. Riker's arguing that this Google Enneagram data proves we are shifting away from that. We are moving to a system where personal, subjective feelings, your lived experience, are considered more valid than hard, verifiable facts.
And that bleeds into everything.
He warns that this subjectivity is being intentionally smuggled into objective fields like medicine, law, and engineering, which inherently destabilizes them.
So if subjective feeling replaces objective truth, what does this all mean for our everyday vocabulary? How does it affect the words you and I use on a daily basis? He quotes psychologist Nick Haslam on the concept of concept creep. Can you explain how Riker applies Haslam's theory to modern political discourse?
Concept creep refers to the way concepts surrounding harm or abuse expand over time to include relatively minor or completely different phenomena. Riker argues that under this new ideological regime, words like racist, violence, abuse, and safety have been systematically inflated.
They don't mean what they used to mean.
Right. Violence used to mean physical harm. Now, in many academic circles, it means hearing an opposing viewpoint that causes emotional discomfort.
Words as weapons.
Safety used to mean physical security from physical danger. Now it means an environment entirely free of intellectual disagreement. Riker argues these words are no longer descriptors of reality. They have become bludgeons used to enforce compliance and silence dissent.
Right. He uses a very specific phrase to illustrate this. He brings up the phrase, all lives matter. Now, Riker points out that, stripped of all political context, this statement is a biological tautology.
A biological tautology, yes.
And just to clarify for our listeners, a biological tautology simply means a statement that is universally, self-evidently true by its very definition. Of course, biologically speaking, every living organism's life has a factual existence, but Riker notes that saying this phrase can now be treated as a fireable offense or even a hate crime.
Yes, and Riker uses that example to illustrate what he calls linguistic possession. When a biological tautology is classified as an act of violence, you are no longer operating in a realm of rational debate.
You're in a completely different paradigm.
Riker's argument is that the overarching goal of this lexical subversion is to make resistance feel immoral by hijacking the very words we use to navigate morality. If the ideology defines disagreement as violence, then by simply debating them, you become a violent person in the eyes of the institution.
The psychological framing perfectly bridges us into the author's next major argument. If we look at how this language policing starts in preschools and infects universities, what is happening in the middle?
The primary education system.
Exactly. This brings us to section 2 of his book, The Cult of Care and the Ideological Virus in Schools. Riker argues that this linguistic subversion has completely hijacked the education system, transforming public schools into what he frankly calls indoctrination camps.
That is exactly right. The author paints a bleak picture of a system that, in his view, has entirely abandoned its historical mandate to educate children in foundational skills like reading, writing, and arithmetic.
They're not learning the basics.
Instead, he sees schools as institutions designed for reprogramming children. He views this as that catabolic cultural revolution happening directly inside the classroom, breaking down the traditional family structure to feed the state.
I want to walk through the specific examples he gives because they really anchor his argument. He talks about a teacher in Manchester, UK, who presented a PowerPoint slide to students listing 102 genders, explicitly teaching that biological sex is a social construct.
102.
Yeah. Then he mentions a London biology teacher who was actually suspended, and this was a man who taught actual hard science like mitosis in the Krebs cycle. He was suspended for refusing to use preferred pronouns for a student.
A science teacher penalized for stating biology.
Right. And perhaps most jarringly, in Leeds, schools replaced the word mother with gestational parent on Mother's Day cards. Kids were instructed to celebrate Gestational Parent Appreciation Day.
Which is just a stunning shift in language.
Now, let me push back here again. A critic of Riker's book might say, look, families look different today. Using gestational parent is just a clunky, bureaucratic way of trying to make sure kids with two dads or kids in foster care don't feel left out on Mother's Day. How does Riker counter that relatively benign interpretation?
Riker aggressively counters that interpretation by arguing it is incredibly naive.
Yeah.
From his perspective, this is absolutely not about inclusion.
What is it about then?
He interprets this shift as a deliberate campaign to erase the feminine archetype and to sever children from the biological and emotional reality of their origins. His argument is that the concept of mother carries thousands of years of profound emotional, cultural, and psychological weight.
It's a foundational human concept.
By reducing that sacred bond to a clinical, sterile, almost dystopian term like gestational parent, he believes the state is attempting to demystify and degrade the family unit.
So the state steps in.
The ultimate goal, according to Riker, is for the state to assert itself as the primary moral and protective authority in a child's life, superseding the parents entirely.
And he argues that this ideological virus is specifically, almost surgically, targeting boys. This is obviously a massive theme for the manosphere demographic reading this text.
It's a huge point of focus, Ro.
Riker cites a 2023 Stanford study showing that boys in gender-balanced classrooms are disciplined 37% more than girls for the exact same behaviors. And his takeaway isn't that boys are inherently more badly behaved.
His takeaway is that boyhood itself is being pathologized.
Exactly. He gives this heartbreaking example of a 6-year-old boy who came home crying because he claimed to be the fastest runner in his class. And the teacher pulled him aside and told him that claiming to be the best was an example of toxic masculinity that could harm the other children's self-esteem.
What's fascinating here is how Riker links this single anecdote to a massive systemic psychological shift. He is critiquing what he calls the cult of care and the rise of trauma-informed education.
The cult of care.
Now, to support his claim that this is systemic, he cites a leaked internal memo from the American Counseling Association, which quietly admitted that trauma frameworks are often exploited by students and administrators alike to avoid accountability and lower academic standards.
Wow, even the ACA admitted it.
Riker's core thesis here is that empathy has been weaponized.
Weaponized empathy. Explain what he means by that.
He means that the education system has replaced traditional virtues like discipline, resilience, and facing natural consequences with emotional hostage-taking. If a child feels unsafe because they lost a race, the system punishes the winner rather than teaching the loser resilience.
So everyone gets dragged down to the lowest common denominator.
By pathologizing competition, physical energy, and the drive for competence traits that Riker points out are biologically and historically prominent in boys, the system is deliberately trying to neuter masculinity. The ideology views male ambition not as a resource to be cultivated, but as a hazard to be managed and suppressed.
He takes this idea of suppressing natural ambition even further with another anecdote. He mentions a 5-year-old who was subjected to a critical consciousness exercise in class.
Oh, the ice cream cone drawing.
Yes. The teacher asked the 5-year-old to draw how capitalism made him feel. And the kid, obviously confused and likely guided by the teacher's framing, drew a frowning ice cream cone. Riker's commentary on this is scathing. He says they don't want children to learn how to read, they want them to learn how to revolt.
This raises a profound philosophical question that Riker is posing to his readers about the role of the state versus the individual. Riker argues that this cult of care is explicitly designed to infantilize society from the ground up.
To make everyone dependent.
Let's think about the logical conclusion of his argument. If you raise an entire generation of children to believe that their subjective feelings trump objective facts, that their intersectional identity trumps their personal duty, and that their emotional distress excuses their lack of academic or professional performance, what kind of adult do you produce?
Not a highly functional one.
Riker answers that you create a populace that is entirely dependent on the state. You replace capable, self-reliant citizens with permanent, fragile clients of a massive bureaucratic therapeutic regime.
That is a very grim diagnosis of the education system, and it leads us perfectly into the next phase of his argument. If these kids graduate from this trauma-informed system and enter the workforce, what happens to the economy?
Right, the corporate layer.
This brings us to Section 3, the feminization of power and the death of merit. Riker takes these concepts of weaponized empathy and lexical subversion and follows them straight into the corporate office. He argues that the corporate HR department has evolved from a simple administrative function into the ultimate ideological enforcer.
Operating much like Soviet political commissars.
Exactly.
Riker's arguments regarding feminism, meritocracy, and corporate culture are incredibly provocative, and they really form the bedrock of why this book resonates so strongly with the men's rights and red pill communities. He posits a theory that female social dynamics have essentially colonized Western institutions, fundamentally and irreversibly altering how power is wielded, how conflicts are resolved, and how success is ultimately measured.
Okay, let's unpack this concept he calls the death of merit. He points out some real-world examples that are really hard to ignore. For instance, he highlights that the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, actually swapped cognitive testing for biographical questionnaires for air traffic controllers.
We're talking about the people managing the skies and preventing mid-air collisions.
It's literally life or death. And then he points to Los Angeles, where the fire department deliberately lowered grip strength requirements so that a higher percentage of female applicants could pass the physical exams. Now let me play the skeptic again.
Go.
A proponent of DEI initiatives might argue that lowering grip strength for firefighters isn't about sacrificing competence, but rather about diversifying a team to handle different types of rescue scenarios where brute strength isn't the only factor. How does Riker dismantle that counter-argument in the text?
Riker dismantles it by introducing his concept of the inversion engine.
The inversion engine.
He claims that modern leftist ideology operates by systematically flipping traditional virtues like stoicism, competitiveness, cold logic, and extreme physical self-reliance into toxic sins.
So they flip the script entirely.
Regarding the firefighter example, Riker argues that if a system requires high grip strength to drag a 200-pound unconscious victim out of a burning building, and that biological requirement naturally favors men due to testosterone and muscle density, the progressive ideology views the requirement itself as oppressive and discriminatory.
So the test itself is viewed as biased, rather than the candidates just having different physical capabilities.
Exactly. Riker argues that true equity, in the ideological sense, doesn't lift the weak up to the standard. It kneecaps the strong to equalize the outcome.
That is a brutal metaphor.
He views this as an outcome engineering process that redistributes success and positions of authority like a Marxist ration card. He fiercely argues that you cannot diversify a burning building or a complex airspace, and that the ideology is literally sacrificing life-saving competence on the altar of political optics.
And he claims that this sacrifice of competence is enforced by what he calls female social dynamics. He defines these dynamics specifically as gossip, shaming, social ostracization, and indirect aggression.
Which he argues HR departments have formalized.
He argues these have become the governing operating system of the corporate world, entirely facilitated by HR departments. To back this up, he points to a 2022 internal survey at Microsoft. According to this survey, 78% of male employees reported that they actively feared speaking up at work.
78%.
They were terrified of HR retaliation or being labeled problematic for simply offering a dissenting opinion on a project.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Riker is describing a workplace environment where straightforward logic and direct debate are viewed as aggressive, hostile acts. He cites an incredible example from Deloitte, the massive accounting firm.
What happened there?
Deloitte banned the word chairman to be more inclusive, but officially allowed invented, ideologically driven spellings like Womex with an X.
That goes right back to lexical subversion.
He also mentions Google's infamous bias bounty program, where employees were financially incentivized, literally paid to report colleagues who questioned diversity policies or made minor linguistic slip-ups.
Getting paid to inform on your coworkers.
Riker likens this corporate atmosphere to East Germany under the Stasi. He argues that modern HR doesn't exist to protect employees or facilitate business. It exists to protect the ideological dogma, utilizing a corporate whisper network to enact bureaucratic purges without any semblance of due process.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because that lack of due process brings us to his heavily emphasized critique of the Me Too movement. Now, it's important to note that Riker does acknowledge that the movement started with valid targets, specifically citing real predators like Harvey Weinstein.
He concedes that the initial impulse was jest.
However, he argues that the movement rapidly mutated. He claims it turned into a gossip superhighway completely lacking in legal or professional due process. An environment where men could have their careers permanently destroyed based on anonymous hearsay or misinterpreted interactions.
And this perceived lack of fairness leads to what Riker diagnoses as the Great Male Surrender. This is a cornerstone of his appeal to the manosphere. He doesn't just rely on anecdotes here. He cites macroeconomic labor statistics showing that prime-age men opting out of the workforce entirely has grown at a massive scale.
It's a huge demographic shift.
He points out that workforce participation for prime-age men has dropped from roughly 87% in 1950 down to about 68% in 2024.
And he connects this macro data to micro everyday frustrations. He brings up a viral Reddit thread that perfectly encapsulates his point. The thread was titled, "I got fired for being good at my job."
Oh, the coder.
Yeah, it was written by a guy who used his coding skills to automate a tedious reporting process, essentially saving his entire team 15 hours of manual labor a week.
In a rational system, that's a massive win.
In a traditional meritocracy, that gets you a promotion or a massive bonus. Instead, HR called him in, accused him of creating dependency, undermining team collaboration, and making his coworkers feel insecure. And he was fired.
Which perfectly proves Riker's point about the inversion engine.
Riker uses this to say that men are looking at this corporate system, seeing that striving gets you labeled toxic, that excellence is actually a fireable offense if you're a man who makes others look bad, and they are simply walking away. They're refusing to participate in an economic game they view as fundamentally rigged against them.
This raises an incredibly important sociological question for you, the listener, to ponder. What happens to the infrastructure of a civilization that systematically demoralizes its primary producers and pathologizes the very traits of ambition and competitiveness that built it?
Things stop working.
Riker's argument is that these men dropping out of the workforce aren't lazy and they aren't losers. From his perspective, they are making a highly rational psychological retreat from institutions that actively view their biological and psychological existence as a problem to be managed and suppressed.
So, if the competent people are leaving and merit is dead, what does this all mean for the corporations themselves? How do they survive? This brings us to a fascinating pivot in the book. Section 4, The Woke Church and Stakeholder Capitalism. Riker claims that major global corporations are no longer just businesses selling widgets, they now function as the secular religion of the left.
This is a vital, structurally complex part of his thesis. He's analyzing how traditional free market forces have been subverted by top-down moral posturing, turning the multinational corporation into an entity that sells ideological absolution rather than just consumer products.
I want you to walk me through the Nike example he uses because it really highlights the financial paradox of this behavior. In 2018, Nike ran a massive ad campaign featuring Colin Kaepernick with the slogan, "Believe in something," even if it means sacrificing everything.
A huge cultural flashpoint.
Riker points out the immediate financial fallout. Nike's stock dropped 31% the following week as boycotts hit. Now, logic dictates that a corporation's primary goal is to make money. Why would a massive company intentionally run a campaign they knew would alienate half their customer base and take a massive financial hit?
Riker argues it was a calculated high-stakes branding ritual.
Yeah.
They willingly sacrificed short-term profits and shareholder value to gain entry into an elite, virtuous ideological club.
So it's about signaling.
Purely. Riker posits that in this new corporate landscape, the customer is no longer viewed as a consumer to be satisfied. They are viewed as a congregant who is expected to kneel at the altar of performative wokeness. Buying the shoe isn't about athletic performance anymore. It's a tithe to the secular church to prove you are on the right side of history.
But how is this enforced at a systemic level? Nike might choose to do it voluntarily, but how are other companies forced into it? Riker points the finger directly at ESG scoring environmental, social, and governance metrics.
The enforcement mechanism.
For the listener who might hear ESG thrown around on the news but doesn't really know how it operates day to day, can you explain the mechanics of how Riker says this is used to control corporations?
Absolutely. Think of ESG as a social credit score for corporations, managed by massive financial institutions. Environmental covers carbon footprints and climate pledges. Social covers diversity quotas, DEI initiatives, and political stances. Governance covers board diversity and executive pay.
So it touches every part of the business.
Riker views ESG not as a noble effort to save the planet, but as a Trojan horse for centralized ideological control. He brings up the incredibly striking, almost unbelievable example of ExxonMobil.
Oh, the board takeover.
Engine number one, which is a tiny activist hedge fund, owned less than 1% of ExxonMobil's stock. Yet they managed to orchestrate a massive board takeover, forcing 3 radical climate activists onto the board of directors of the largest oil and gas company in America.
Wait, less than 1%? How does a group with less than 1% ownership dictate the board of a multi-billion-dollar oil giant?
According to Riker's analysis, it happens because of the immense concentrated power of unelected asset managers at mega firms like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. He specifically calls out BlackRock's CEO, Larry Fink, for pushing what they call stakeholder capitalism.
Doesn't make sense on paper.
Riker argues this phrase sounds noble and community-focused, but it effectively abolishes traditional fiduciary duty. It replaces shareholder primacy, the legal obligation to make money for the people who invested, with political propaganda.
Because they hold the purse strings.
These asset managers control trillions of dollars. They score companies not on their return on equity or operational efficiency, but on their adherence to the progressive ESG checklist. If a company doesn't comply with the ideology, these massive firms will withhold capital, vote against the board, and essentially starve the company out of the market.
That completely explains why so many corporations suddenly seem to speak with the exact same political voice. And he points out the sheer absurdity of some of the internal corporate rituals resulting from this pressure.
The confessionals.
He mentions Airbnb forcing its employees into allyship workshops where they literally had to stand up and confess to benefiting from white supremacy, regardless of their actual personal backgrounds. He mentions companies like Patagonia and Ben & Jerry's, who he says don't even pretend to sell jackets or ice cream anymore. They strictly sell moral absolution.
Ben & Jerry's even released a flavor called Peculiar Polarization.
Right, which was explicitly designed to shame the political opponents of the progressive left.
If we connect this to the bigger sociological picture Riker is painting, he is arguing that the Chief Diversity Officer, the CDO, has become the new high priest of this secular religion. Their job isn't human resources or talent acquisition.
It's an inquisition.
Their job is enforcing strict orthodoxy, rooting out ideological heresy among the staff, and administering the modern sacraments of forced apology and public humiliation. Riker sees this as a mass conversion ritual taking place in the boardroom, where generating profit is entirely secondary to maintaining ideological purity.
Which perfectly transitions us into the next major escalation in the book. Section 5, the biological blind spot, and the purge protocol. Because if you are enforcing a strict, unquestionable religion, Objective facts and empirical science become your biggest, most dangerous enemies. Riker claims that modern leftism is actively ignoring, erasing, and punishing science.
The author provides a deeply forensic, highly detailed look at how objective empirical reality is being systematically subordinated to subjective identity narratives, particularly within the hallowed halls of academia and modern medicine.
Let's walk through the example he gives of the Columbia University professor, because this really highlights the clash between biology and ideology.
The gamete example.
Yes, this professor was officially reprimanded by the university administration for stating in a biology class that biological sex is defined by gamete size, meaning males produce small, mobile gametes called sperm, and females produce large, stationary gametes called eggs.
This is day one, foundational biology.
It doesn't get more basic than that. But students complained that hearing this fact caused them emotional distress. Riker points out that teaching a fundamental, observable, indisputable fact of reproductive biology is now actively punished as a harmful act.
What Riker finds most fascinating and terrifying here is the institutional capitulation. The universities are surrendering to the students, and it extends to the highest levels of medicine.
Yeah, the WPATH example.
He points to the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, or WPATH. They recently released their 8th Standards of Care, and in it, they completely removed the previous requirement for comprehensive psychological evaluations prior to a patient receiving cross-sex hormone therapy.
Removing the guardrails.
Riker argues this is no longer medical care guided by caution and the Hippocratic Oath. He calls it ideological acceleration. Furthermore, he notes that the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, began tracking cervical cancer rates in a demographic they labeled people with cervixes.
Effectively erasing the biological category of female from vital public health data.
Riker's argument is that you cannot properly track, research, or treat a sex-specific disease if you deliberately obfuscate the biological reality of the patients out of a misguided desire to be linguistically inclusive.
It's the ultimate triumph of the lexical subversion he talked about in Chapter 1. But here is where it gets really intense. He talks about the deliberate institutional purge of evolutionary psychology.
Well, this is a major battleground for him.
He gives the example of a Yale graduate student who applied for grant funding to study the evolutionary sex differences in human jealousy. The review panel outright denied the funding, explicitly claiming the topic was inherently biased and harmful.
Before the research even began.
And then there's the case of David Buss, who is arguably one of the most cited, highly respected evolutionary psychologists alive today. Buss was canceled, deplatformed, and accused by student groups of promoting rape culture simply for discussing the biological realities of human mate selection strategies. Let me ask you, based on Riker's text, why is evolutionary psychology specifically targeted so heavily by this ideology?
Riker posits that evolutionary psychology is uniquely dangerous to the woke ideology because it provides empirical, biological explanations for human behavior.
It provides an alternative explanation.
It explains why men naturally compete for status, why women are historically more selective in choosing mates, and how human aggression is biologically linked to testosterone. The reigning progressive ideology demands that all disparities in outcome, whether in the corporate boardroom or the criminal justice system, be viewed solely as a result of systemic oppression and sociological conditioning.
So they can't allow biological explanations to exist.
Therefore, any hard science that points to innate biological differences must be framed as blasphemy and purged from the academy, because it threatens the foundational premise of their worldview.
And how do they enforce this purge? How do they keep thousands of academics and corporate employees in line? Through anonymous reporting systems that create a culture of absolute terror. He mentions the University of California's Dignity Action app.
Snitch app.
This is an application that allows students and faculty to file anonymous complaints about perceived microaggressions, requiring no hard evidence and offering no standard of proof. He shares a surreal, almost comical story about a Pfizer employee who was placed on administrative leave and formally investigated by HR because an anonymous tip via one of these portals said he looked cisgender in a team photo.
That is just wild to think about.
I mean, how do you even defend yourself against an accusation of looking a certain way?
You can't, and that's exactly the point Riker is making. He uses these examples to illustrate the sociological concept of the purity spiral.
The purity spiral.
The purity spiral is a dynamic where a political or religious movement begins eating its own members by constantly demanding more and more extreme displays of ideological purity. Nuance becomes heresy, silence becomes violence.
You can never be pure enough.
By utilizing these anonymous reporting apps, Riker argues that institutions have successfully created a Stasi-like environment of paranoia and self-censorship. It's an environment where your professional survival and loyalty are measured entirely by your willingness to denounce your peers over imagined slights.
That sense of paranoia brings us to what are arguably the darkest, most intense chapters of the book. Section 6, The Satanic Inversion and the Family Collapse. This is where Riker claims we are witnessing the ultimate subversion of morality. A space where good becomes defined as evil and evil becomes defined as good.
Yes, this section represents the author's most severe, unapologetic critique. He shifts his focus entirely to the state's relationship with the family unit and religious institutions.
Going right after the foundations.
He argues that the ideology is not just altering institutions, but actively working to dismantle the fundamental, historical building blocks of human civilization.
I want to unpack this linguistic normalization he exposes regarding predatory behavior. He points to recent academic and sociological literature where the term pedophile is being systematically replaced by the new term minor attracted person, or MAP.
This is a deeply disturbing linguistic shift.
He notes a staggering 700% spike in the use of this new term across academic journals. Riker argues this is not a clinical update. It is a deliberate linguistic invasion designed to sanitize and destigmatize a predatory, destructive pathology.
From Riker's point of view, the juxtaposition of public health priorities here is what truly defines the satanic inversion. He highlights a deeply disturbing policy reality regarding the UK's National Health Service, the NHS.
What were they doing?
They were discovered to be giving taxpayer-funded therapy vouchers to these minor attracted persons to help them live fulfilling lives and manage their urges. Yet, simultaneously, the very same NHS was actively cutting funding for men's suicide prevention programs.
That is just an unbelievable contrast.
Riker uses this stark contrast to illustrate his concept of the satanic inversion. The bureaucratic state prioritizing the emotional accommodation and destigmatization of sexual predators over the survival and mental health of desperate, everyday men.
And he argues the state is directly, aggressively targeting the nuclear family, and specifically the role of the biological father. He cites Swedish public policies that were explicitly designed in writing to minimize paternal attachment in early childhood.
Minimizing the father's role by law.
The stated goal of these policies was to guide children toward more balanced caregiver dependence, which Riker translates directly as meaning dependency on the state apparatus rather than the father. He tells this infuriating story of a Swedish father who was literally fined by the government.
Fined for changing a diaper.
Yes, forced into mandatory psychological therapy because he refused to let a state social services worker observe him changing his own child's diaper. The state claimed his refusal proved he lacked emotional availability.
This specific anecdote raises a massive question regarding state overreach and parental rights. Riker compounds this by giving examples from the US and UK of public schools implementing policies to actively hide a child's social gender transition from their own parents.
So the state is keeping secrets from the parents.
His overarching thesis here is that the bureaucratic nanny state wants to completely replace the family. According to Riker, the state views the nuclear family and the biological father's protective authority in particular as a competing moral authority.
They want a monopoly on authority.
By pathologizing a father's natural protective instincts, the state seeks to drive a wedge between parent and child, creating a generation of children who look to the government rather than their families for truth, safety, and identity.
He extends this idea of the state eliminating competing moral authorities to religious institutions as well. He talks about a Swedish Lutheran school that was fined $50,000 by the government for refusing to fly a pride flag during a state-mandated celebration.
Forced display of ideological symbols.
He mentions the Salvation Army, an inherently Christian charity, being threatened with the loss of massive government grants unless they fundamentally change their internal hiring policies regarding LGBTQ employees, policies which were based on their religious doctrines.
Riker interprets these events as the final phase of ideological capture. He argues that the ultimate goal of what he terms Satanic Marxism is total unyielding compliance to the state.
Total compliance.
By forcing churches to host events that violate their sacred doctrines, or financially ruin them for refusing to display ideological symbols, the state is demanding that religious institutions bend the knee. The goal is to prove that the state's ideology is the supreme moral law of the land, replacing loyalty to family and God with an absolute, unquestioning loyalty to the progressive state apparatus.
So, after laying out this incredibly bleak, highly detailed forensic autopsy of our captured institutions, what is his solution? Does he offer a way out? This brings us to our final section, the resistance reclaiming truth. Riker explicitly states in the text, the revolution won't be televised, it will be read.
He doesn't just leave his readers in despair. He offers a very specific, actionable battle plan for his audience.
Yes, the author pivots sharply from sociological diagnosis to practical prescription. He offers a framework for how individuals, particularly the men reading this book, can build psychological and practical immunity to this ideological virus.
It's a very grounded approach.
I want to unpack his concept of physical mastery because it's a fascinating counter approach to an ideological problem. He tells this great anecdote about a 10-year-old boy spending an afternoon in a hot garage, fixing a bent lawnmower blade, getting his hands dirty, and figuring out the literal mechanics of a small engine.
A very tactile example.
And then he talks about a man in Ohio who spent 11 grueling months rebuilding a 1972 Ford Bronco from scrap metal and rusted bolts. Now, why does Riker dedicate so much space to these mechanical stories? He views this physical competence as actual, literal immunity to the ideology. How does that work?
The psychological grounding of this advice is really quite brilliant within the context of his broader argument. Riker contrasts the fragility and subjectivity of the woke mind virus, which relies entirely on policing words, shifting definitions, and emotional manipulation, with the cold, undeniable reality of physical mechanics.
The physical world doesn't care about your feelings.
As he points out, you cannot gaslight an engine into working. You cannot debate a torque wrench. Your lived experience does not matter to a rusted bolt.
I love that line.
By engaging in physical mastery, men root themselves firmly in objective, biological reality. Riker argues that a man who knows how to build, repair, and maintain the physical world around him is inherently resistant to an ideology that is built entirely on semantic games and subjective feelings.
That makes total sense. He's saying ground yourself in the real world, and the digital ideological world loses its grip on you. And this leads to his next point, the absolute necessity of refusing to kneel. He urges his readers not to participate in the shame spiral.
Refusing to play their game.
He brings up Jordan Peterson's famous initial rise to prominence, which centered on his refusal to use state-mandated preferred pronouns in Canada. Riker frames Peterson's refusal not as an act of prejudice or hatred, but as a principled, necessary defense of objective biological reality and free speech against state coercion.
And he points out that this resistance isn't just coming from the manosphere. He points to grassroots resistance across different demographics.
Like the mothers in the UK.
Exactly. He highlights a group of mothers in the UK known as Get the L Out, who literally stormed local school board meetings to aggressively demand the removal of critical race theory and extreme gender ideology from their children's curriculum.
They pushed back hard.
They didn't ask nicely, they didn't negotiate, they demanded accountability. Riker champions this refusal to be polite in the face of what he views as ideological capture. He argues that politeness is often the leash the ideology uses to control dissenters.
He also provides a deeply unflattering psychological profile of the modern leftist enforcer, the people running the HR departments and university tribunals. He cites psychological data suggesting these individuals generally exhibit high levels of neuroticism.
And he argues they use the progressive ideology as a coping mechanism for their own personal failures and lack of tangible achievement.
So it's a power trip for the powerless.
He claims it's essentially a narcissistic endeavor to gain moral status and wield power through the currency of victimhood rather than through actual competence.
Which logically leads to his ultimate final call to action for the reader, building alternatives. Riker argues that men must completely stop trying to reform existing institutions that have already been thoroughly captured by HR and DEI bureaucracies. It's a waste of energy.
He says the old system is dead.
Instead, he fiercely advocates for a parallel economy and culture. He calls on men to create new fraternities, new trade schools that focus on hard skills, new independent businesses, and strong, resilient, traditional families that operate entirely outside the reach of this ideological framework.
His final vision for men is clear. Strive, endure, overcome the physical world, and completely ignore the accusations of toxicity from a system that is inherently sick.
It is a sweeping, unapologetic manifesto. So what does this all mean for you, the listener? We have covered an immense amount of ground today, unpacking Riker's highly controversial, intensely forensic view of how society operates today. To wrap things up, we want to leave you with a final provocative thought inspired by the text, something to chew on that we haven't explicitly spelled out yet.
Consider this, based on Riker's initial arguments regarding lexical subversion. If language truly dictates the boundaries of our thoughts, what everyday words are you using right now that have been subtly redefined for you without your conscious permission?
That's a great question.
When you use words like harm, safety, or justice in your daily life, are your thoughts truly your own? Or have they been invisibly programmed by the vocabulary of the institutions around you? Who wrote the dictionary you are currently using to understand your own reality?
It is a heavy, unsettling question to consider. If you are fascinated by these arguments, if you want to explore the dense history of our institutions before they were captured, and if you want a true deep dive into the red-pilled manosphere's perspective on modern culture, you absolutely need to check Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks to buy the ebook.
It's called Insidious Satanic Marxism, Catabolic Cultural Revolutions, Positional War, Purity Spirals, Purges, and the Woke Mind Virus.
And remember to follow the author Conrad Schraker at Substack to keep up with his writing. Finally, if you enjoyed this exhaustive deep dive today, please hit that like button and subscribe to the show. It means the world to us and helps us keep bringing you these deep explorations. Until next time, keep questioning the world around you and keep learning.